What's going on, everybody? Kalip's Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my first impressions of the Nokia G400 5G. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, before we actually get into the phone itself, I want to take a look at what comes in this really large box. I mean, this is a pretty unnecessarily large box. I mean, especially compared to a lot of the new Samsung phones, for example, that have these really tiny thin boxes. But despite having such a large box, there's really not a whole lot in it. We got a USB-C wall adapter, which is definitely a nice thing to see because nowadays a lot of phones don't come with this. A quick start guide, of course, and finally a double-sided USB-C cable. So in general, while again, this is definitely one of the larger boxes I've seen, there's really not a whole lot in it. But again, I am definitely glad to see we do get a wall adapter here. But moving on to the phone itself, with the Nokia G400 5G, we're getting a 6.58-inch 120Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 401, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So definitely a nice display here. At just over 6.5 inches, it's definitely on the larger side, which is a good thing if you're consuming a lot of content. And with a 20:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a taller and more narrow form factor. So if you're doing something like watching a video in landscape mode, for example, you're going to get a more immersive experience. And if you're doing something like browsing the web, reading, using social media, with dimensions like this, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. In addition to this, with a 1080p resolution, everything looks real nice and sharp. The colors and stuff do look pretty good. And with a 120Hz refresh rate, the movement on the screen is quite a bit faster and smoother than your average smartphone. So if you're doing something like watching a video, playing a game, or even just using the phone in general, things are going to be a little bit more fluid, and overall the phone is just going to feel a little bit more premium to use. Now, all this being said, the display in and of itself is really good for what it is. But one thing that's not too impressive here is the viewing angles. As you can see, they're really not very good. So if you're in a brighter area, like maybe outside in the sun, this phone is going to be quite a bit harder to see than something like a Samsung Galaxy A53 5G, for example, that has a Super AMOLED display instead. But again, other than this, the display we're getting with the Nokia G400 5G is really good. And if you're consuming a lot of content and you're just going to be on your phone a lot in general, I do think you will get a pretty good experience here. Now, when it comes to storage, with the Nokia G400 5G, we're getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion. So on one hand, in this price range, you can do better if you really want to, but it's definitely pretty average. I mean, 64GB really isn't terrible. So for the average user, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone and you make sure to utilize the microSD card expansion when you can, then you should at least get by with this phone. But that being said, if you're more of a power user, if you have a bunch of apps, especially stuff like games, then you are probably going to want to go for a phone that has more storage. But again, for the average user, as long as you don't have a bunch of apps and stuff like that, the 64GB we get with this phone should be at least okay. Now for security features, the Nokia G400 5G does have Face Unlock, as well as a fingerprint scanner right here on the power key. Definitely a great spot for a fingerprint scanner, but let's go ahead and give it a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, this fingerprint scanner is real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, remember, this phone does have Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here. For the front-facing camera, we got a typical water drop notch. This camera is 16 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 48 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So in general, this phone does have a pretty good amount of camera features. Usually a phone doesn't have an ultra-wide camera and no macro camera. They typically either have both or just a macro camera and no ultra-wide camera, but in my opinion, an ultra-wide camera is a lot more useful. So personally, I'm okay with this, but keep in mind, if you do want a macro camera, then this is probably going to be disappointing for you, because again, this phone does not have a macro camera. But in general, despite that, I do think this phone has a pretty good camera setup in general. Now, of course, being that this is my first impressions video, I haven't actually gotten a chance to test the camera yet, but given its price range and the fact that it has a 48 megapixel main camera, I am expecting the photos to be good. In addition to this, for video, this phone has a max recording quality of 1080p at 60 frames per second in both the rear and front cameras, so definitely nice that we get that higher frame rate here. A lot of phones in this price range, and even above for that matter, can only record at 1080p at 30 frames per second. So if you do want those smoother clips, maybe you're making slow motion videos, for example, whatever the case may be, having that option definitely gives you a little bit more flexibility when you're recording videos. So in general, if you're taking a lot of photos, you want good photo quality and a decent amount of features, just based on what I'm seeing so far, I do think the Nokia G400 5G will be a pretty good choice. But that being said, again, I haven't actually used the camera yet, so if you do want to learn more about the camera and what it's like to actually use it, definitely stay tuned for my full review. Now, as far as RAM and processor go, with the Nokia G400 5G, we're getting 4GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 480 5G processor. Now, again, since these really are just my first impressions, I haven't actually gotten a chance to use this phone a ton, but from my experience for more basic activities, it has been decently fast. But keep in mind, the Qualcomm Snapdragon 480 5G, while definitely being good, is still very much a mid-range processor, so definitely don't expect to get crazy speeds here. If you're going to be doing things like high-performance gaming, or you're really just going to be on your phone all the time, in that kind of situation, then yeah, I would definitely recommend considering a higher end phone that has a faster processor. But for more basic activities, this phone is definitely not slow by any means. And for stuff like web browsing, social media, streaming content like videos and music, and some light mobile gaming every now and then, this phone will absolutely get the job done. Now, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on it, and here are the scores I got. So again, compared to a lot of other mid-range phones, this is definitely not the fastest phone out there. In fact, for a mid-range phone, I do think it's a little bit on the lower end. But that being said, again, for the average user, if you're really not doing a ton on your phone and you just need something for more basic activities, then again, I do think the Nokia G400 5G will get the job done. But that being said, what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone will be an upgrade for you, because depending on your current device, it may or may not be. Now for the battery, the Nokia G400 5G has a 5000 mAh battery that supports 20-watt fast charging, so definitely a great battery here. With a 5000 mAh battery, this is a really large battery, so you can expect to get great battery life and longevity. So if you're in a situation where maybe you're not always around a charger and you want something that's really going to last all day, this phone is going to be a great choice for that. And with 20-watt fast charging, although this still is definitely not the strongest fast charging in the world, it is really good for a mid-range phone, and in my experience, the charging speeds have been great. And in case you're wondering, the Nokia G400 5G, like most mid-range phones, does not have wireless charging, so if that is a feature you really want, then definitely keep this in mind. On the other hand though, the Nokia G400 5G does have NFC, so if you like to make contactless mobile payments using tap and pay, keep in mind you will be able to do that with this phone. But in conclusion, my overall first impressions of the Nokia G400 5G. In general, I really think this phone's biggest strength is definitely the display. The performance is okay, the features are pretty decent, and it does seem like the camera setup is really good, but compared to other mid-range 5G phones like this, there's really not a whole lot this phone offers that they don't. But that being said, again, the display is really nice, the image itself looks great, so if you're consuming a lot of content like watching videos, playing games, and even more basic things like reading and using social media, I do think you will get a great experience with this phone. And again, the battery is really large, the performance is decent for what it is, and the camera, although I haven't personally used it yet, does seem like it's going to take really good photos, and I'm definitely looking forward to trying it out. But this concludes my first impressions video for the Nokia G400 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram, and as always, I will see you in the next video.